This event is one of the most significant of the last century. The world watched with bated breath as the Chinese government seemed to be on the verge of collapse. Western leaders encouraged openness and democracy. For a moment, it seemed like China was about to make an amazing leap forward into freedom. But then suddenly tanks rolled in, firing into crowds of unarmed civilians. This is Tiananmen Square, 1989, and this is why China doesn't want you to talk about it. Imagine it's the year 1989 and you're watching CNN. For months now, you've been hearing about dramatic events happening in China. Pro-democracy protests have broken out across the country. It began with students in the capital city of Beijing. They were protesting against censorship, but quickly their demands grew. They wanted political reform, and they wanted elections. At first, the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, tried to ignore them. After all, who could stop a tank with a flower? But the protests only grew. Soon thousands had joined, and then tens of thousands, and then hundreds of thousands. And on June, when the government attempted to clear the square of protesters so that the city could host a military parade, things got violent. As the police moved in, the protesters fought back. They formed a human chain around the statue of Mao Zedong and sang the national anthem. Some even stood in front of the tanks, blocking their path. The soldiers didn't fire on the crowd. They must have felt like they were in some alternate reality. China was supposed to be a dictatorship. How were these people able to stand up to the army? But then, from the corner of their eye, they saw a man holding a red cloth aloft. He was standing on top of a nearby tank and waving it towards the soldiers. The soldiers rallied to his call and began driving into the crowd. People fell under the wheels and were mowed down by the dozens. Those who didn't run away fast enough were dragged off by the soldiers and beaten. It became known as the June 4th incident. And though there are no official figures, it's estimated that at least a few hundred people died that day. The government did its best to cover up the massacre. They arrested journalists, shut down internet services, and sealed off the city. But words still got out, and the rest of the world watched in horror. What happened at Tiananmen Square wasn't just a protest or a massacre, it was a revolution. It was a chance for the Chinese people to cast off the shackles of communism and finally embrace freedom. And for a moment it looked like it might actually work. It all started a few months before with a series of economic reforms. China was becoming increasingly prosperous, but the communist government made it clear that there would be no political reform to match. That's where Hu Yaobang comes in. In April 1986, he was appointed General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. He took this opportunity to loosen the government's control over the press. Suddenly, newspapers and magazines contained articles that criticized the government and exposed corruption among party officials. To many young Chinese, this was a revelation. For the first time in their lives, they could read about their country's problems in the media. They began to demand that the government do something about it. The response was swift and brutal. Hu Yaobang was purged from the party and later died of a heart attack. But this only fueled the protests. Now thousands of students gathered in Tiananmen Square, calling for the restoration of Hu Yaobang and for freedom of speech. The government ignored them until, on May 1989, a popular reform-minded journalist named Feng Lizhi published an open letter in support of the protesters. The government's response was to arrest him and place him under house arrest. That's when the protests really began to take off. As more and more people joined, the demands of the protesters became more radical. They wanted a complete overhaul of the government, including direct elections for the legislature and an end to the one-party state. The government responded by cutting off food, water, and electricity to the square. They also sent in thousands of police to beat and arrest the protesters. On June, the government declared martial law and ordered the protesters to leave the square. But they refused. Instead, they formed a human chain around the monument to the people's heroes. When the police tried to break the chain, the protesters fought back. They hurled rocks and bottles at the police and blocked their path with their bodies. The police responded with batons and tear gas. And that's when the real bloodshed began. We'll never know exactly what happened next, because the government sealed off the city and prevented journalists from entering. But we do know that several hundred protesters were killed by the police and the army. The news of the massacre spread quickly around the world and shocked people everywhere. Many Western governments called for an investigation, but the Chinese government refused, saying that it was an internal matter. They also expelled several foreign journalists and shut down the internet. To this day, we don't know how many people were killed during the Tiananmen Square protests. The Chinese government says that only a few dozen people died, but most estimates put the death toll in the hundreds or even thousands. In the aftermath of the massacre, the Chinese government went to great lengths to cover up its crimes. They arrested and tortured dissidents, shut down pro-democracy groups, and purged suspected dissidents from the Communist Party. They even went so far as to destroy evidence of the massacre itself, including the bodies of those killed. To this day, the Chinese government continues to crack down on anyone who dares to talk about the massacre. They have passed laws making it illegal to commemorate the event and have arrested hundreds of people for simply posting about it online. So why is the Chinese government so afraid of the world learning about Tiananmen Square? There are 3 reasons. First, the government is afraid that the world will see it as a sign of weakness. They want to appear strong and in control, not weak and vulnerable. Second, they are afraid that the world will impose sanctions or other punishments on China. If the world knew the truth about Tiananmen Square, they might not do business with China, or might impose other punishments. And third, they are afraid that the Chinese people will be inspired to rise up against the government. If the Chinese people learned that their government was willing to kill hundreds of its own citizens, they might not be so quick to obey its orders. The story of Tiananmen Square is a story of hope and tragedy. It's the story of a people who dared to stand up for their rights and freedoms, and the story of a government that was willing to crush them in the streets. It's a story that the Chinese government doesn't want you to know, but it's a story that needs to be told. China today is a different place than it was in 1989. It's wealthier, more powerful, and more influential on the world stage. But the government is still just as repressive. If anything, things have gotten worse since Tiananmen Square. The government has cracked down even harder on dissent and has imprisoned hundreds of journalists and activists. The Tiananmen Square protests may have failed, but the fight for democracy in China continues. Every day, ordinary Chinese citizens are risking their lives to stand up for freedom. They are blogging, tweeting, and sharing videos online. They are organizing protests and distributing leaflets. And they are voting with their feet, leaving China and starting new lives in freedom. The Chinese government may not want you to talk about Tiananmen Square, but by talking about it, we can help keep the memory of this important event alive. We can learn from the bravery of the protesters and the cruelty of the government. And we can support the brave Chinese people who continue to fight for democracy today. What are your thoughts on this episode? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe for more episodes. Thanks for watching. See you next time.